And welcome back to this training series on FEMA P-1000, Safer, Stronger, Smarter, a guide to improving school natural hazard safety. You're watching Module 2, Identifying Relevant Natural Hazards and Making School Buildings Safer. This is the second of 6 training videos that are outlined here. If you're following along with us chronologically, the last video you watched was Module 1, which was an introduction to FEMA P-1000. In this module, Module 2, Barry will review identifying relevant natural hazards and provide guidance on making school buildings safer. Looking ahead, Module 3 will go over planning school emergency responses and disaster recovery. Module 4 will touch on engaging the whole community. Module 5 will discuss supplemental technical guidance in FEMA P-1000. And lastly, the final training video, Module 6, will review some funding resources. So with that, Barry, let's get started.
Okay, thanks, Gigi. This is actually my favorite part of the series because I get to talk about risk. Engineers like to think about risk as the product of 2 variables, hazard and vulnerability. A higher hazard exposure is multiplied by a higher vulnerability, which is the building vulnerability, or as I like to think about it, also the lack of knowledge about vulnerability will result in a higher risk. It's no coincidence that we titled this project Safer, Stronger, Smarter, a guide to improving school natural hazard safety, because the smarter we are about school safety advocacy, the safer and the stronger schools become. So let's begin to make the connection between your schools and the hazards that they are exposed to. So some things to think about: where your school district is located, how many school buildings and facilities are part of your district, how many students are in your buildings on any given day, how many school administrators, teachers, staff, visitors are in your buildings on any given day, how dependent is your community on schools, on your school facilities during disasters in non-disaster time. That gives you a sense of what you're dealing with. So why does this matter? Well, disasters can have both an immediate and a long-term impact. The immediate impact, obviously, is you can have deaths or injuries. The longer term is that you can have experiences of emotional trauma. You can have education disruption, which is huge. School operations can be severely impacted by school closures. These impacts matter, and they should be considered in emergency operations plans. So let's talk a little bit about why your schools might be vulnerable. Well, first of all, schools often have large assembly rooms such as auditoriums and gymnasiums. They can also generally have taller sections surrounding the classrooms, and they often have a higher exposure to natural hazards. Sometimes schools are pre-designated as emergency community shelters and may not have been designed to withstand the hazard and remain functional for occupancy after. Building codes require more stringent risk categories, resulting in design loads for buildings that are used as emergency or post-disaster shelters. So that's something to consider. Also, schools often remain in use for longer periods of time other than regular buildings, and they're often considered to be safe buildings just because they're schools and they're built. Lack of consistent capital renewal funds leaves older schools buildings more vulnerable to damage as they were built to older building codes and could be out of date, obviously. So let's talk about your exposure hazards and what you need to think about. You need to think about where you live or where your schools are located. What types of natural hazards does your community face? What, if any, recent experiences have the schools in your community had with natural disasters? So let's start with earthquakes. You can see in this chart, the map on the left gives you a color coding of regions of seismicity from a very high, the purple color, to a low, which is the green. 39 states in the United States have a significant earthquake hazard. Schools in the moderately high, high, and very high regions of seismicity should include earthquake risk in their school hazard safety plan. Next, floods. All 50 states and territories experience floods, with the most severe losses being experienced in Louisiana, Texas, New Jersey, New York, Florida, and all of the other states listed there. Over 6,000 schools in the United States are in mapped special flood hazard areas, something to keep mind of. Coastal areas and places subject to extreme rains or weather-related events are flood prone also. Next, hurricanes. Hurricane hazard areas included basically the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, Hawaii, and U.S. territories in the Caribbean and South Pacific. Hurricane season runs from June through November, and typical hurricane seasons bring about 6 hurricanes. Active seasons may bring as many as 15. And you can see by the color coding there, the hurricanes involve both heavy rains and high winds in the color coding. Tornadoes, over 1,000 tornadoes are recorded in the US each year. The most destructive and deadly and strong are the strong tornadoes in the central United States, as you can see on this map. The warmer orange color there is showing you a wind speed of 250 miles per hour. These are used for storm shelter designs. And then going out from that to 200, 160, and then 130 miles per hour. I might point out that in 1999, Salt Lake City, which is in the white zone, by the way, with a wind speed of 130 miles per hour, experienced an F2 tornado that lasted about 14 minutes, had 115 mile per hour winds. We had 1 fatality and over 100 injuries and damage of approximately $172 million. So even if you think you're in the white zone and safe, you probably want to think about that. Tsunamis, all coastal areas can experience a tsunami. In the US, the regions of the highest tsunami risk include Hawaii, Alaska, the coastal West Coast. High hazard level also exists for American Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. Generally, a damaging tsunami occurs approximately twice a year in the entire world. High winds, these are straight line winds and downslope winds that are not caused by tornadoes or hurricanes, can occur anywhere in the United States. These downslope winds damage can be created in mountainous areas and in canyons, and it can occur at any time. So we wrap up this section by giving you a checklist. As we've gone through these hazards, we're now looking to see what we need to do next. So as you can see at the top of this list, we have earthquakes on our list. It says, is your school in a moderate region of seismicity or higher, as per that figure that I showed you, 2.1? If so, then we're encouraging you to read the earthquake supplement. Likewise, for floods, if your school is located behind a levee, a storm surge, inundation area, flood zones, or does it have a history of flooding, then we're encouraging you to read the flood supplement. Hurricanes, that shaded area in figure 2.2, or Hawaii or any of the US territories, you need to read the hurricane supplement. Tornadoes, likewise, if you looked at that figure and saw the shaded areas, you would want to read the tornado supplement. Tsunamis, same situation in the table. The tsunami supplement would be one that you would want to read. And then high winds are really something that can be experienced anywhere. And so reading the high wind supplement is also important. We also have several other rather abbreviated supplements on snowstorms, volcanic eruptions, and wildfires. And if those are something you're concerned about, you should feel free to read those also. So what are some of the takeaways from the natural hazards exposure that we'd like you to understand? Well, first, where the hazards typically occur in your region, so this is something you would want to know about, its frequency of occurrence and probability of intensity, the warning time that you might receive before the hazard, the duration, and the likelihood of follow-on hazards. These 5 factors help determine which hazards require immediate attention or more long-term planning. They also determine if mitigation efforts should be addressing multiple hazards. Here's an example of a multi-hazard mitigation plan for Guam. You can see by the table on the right, the hazard is listed on the left: earthquakes, flooding, severe wind, slope failure, tsunami, inundation, wildfire. And then on the right, the hazard zone. And so it's specifically listed as very high, and all the way down. So you'll want to look to your state hazard mitigation plan to figure out some of these exposures for your schools. So if we say that children are required to be in school and their *1 job is to learn, then we need some focusing questions, right? We need to know who is responsible for school safety in your community. Are schools in your community vulnerable to any of these natural hazards? Is school safety a priority in your community? Will your schools be able to reopen if disaster happens in your community? And how can you help garner public support and funding resources in advance of school safety efforts, to advance those efforts. So once you have a sense of your school buildings and your hazard exposure, the overall vision for this guidebook is as follows. One, we want to incorporate as many actions and actors as we can. We'll talk about including whole communities in a later module, but we want to think in terms of the actions that we need to have happen and the people that we would like to play a role in mitigating those actions. School emergency management and preparedness practitioners work to build this capacity through things such as before the hazard, prevention, protection, and mitigation, during the hazard, and this is the response, and then after the hazard, and this is the recovery part of it. So why is a comprehensive approach so important? Well, we know safety and educational continuity for sure are things on our mind when we think about having safe schools, but also emotional well-being and providing for emergency shelters. They should equally be involved in the mix of our understanding of this. Also recognizing that mitigation dollars spent before will give saving benefits after a hazard event. And also the idea of community resilience and accelerating the personal, family, and community recovery methods. We've mentioned that we want you to be considering this guide, the guide for developing high quality school emergency operations plan, together with this manual, this guidebook, because there are a number of things that are integral to that are really important. There is a website called the Readiness Emergency Management for Schools, or the REMS Technical Assistance website, and it provides a chart of the states in the United States. And in that chart, if you click on the chart, for instance, this is showing a pop-up for Puerto Rico, you can find the states or territories' state emergency management resources that they might have, the state safety and security mandates and policies, and then state field offices or federal partners. So it's a good thing to start there to see what your state has in terms of these resources as you travel down this road. So these are some questions that we want to try and answer. How do we make school buildings safer? Both existing buildings, prioritizing the most vulnerable first, and new buildings, ensuring that buildings are built to the latest standards, latest hazard-resistant building codes, and the areas of least risk of hazards made possible. We want to make sure that there's a plan of emergency response. We also want to plan for short and long-term recovery. And then we also want to engage the whole community in comprehensive school safety planning. The answer to these 4 questions make up the heart of this book. So let's talk about making school buildings safer. So first, understand that school buildings vary tremendously, both in characteristics, size, age, condition, and construction materials. The materials that school buildings are made of are wood, concrete, masonry, or a combination of any of these materials. And then school settings, they can be in dense urban environments, rural or suburban settings. So you have a variety of things to consider. Also, school populations are diverse. Some schools have, for instance, large numbers of children with disabilities. Location dictates where the natural hazards might be a threat, as we were showing you on the charts before. Each individual school will have a unique situation warranting a corresponding mitigation plan that is specific to that school. This is important to understand, that we're looking at the local impact for you and your schools. So while school buildings can generally withstand common weather events, infrequent natural hazards put an enormous stress or loads on these buildings and can lead to severe damage or even collapse. It's important to understand the different types of natural hazards that affect buildings in different ways. For instance, ground shaking versus a hurricane storm surge versus tornadoes, winds. Schools in areas prone to hazards that provide little or no warning need to have heightened sense of potential school damage. Warning times vary for different hazards, which determine the feasibility of evacuating versus sheltering in place. This is a chart that gives you some suggested hazard warning times. As you see the chart on the left, the earthquake, for instance, has an expected warning time of little to no time, seconds of minutes of warning at the best. And so the expectation for the school is that it would be occupied, and given that lack of warning. Floods, usually you have hours to days of warning, so sometimes you can evacuate buildings in that case, except for instance, flash flooding. Hurricanes, you generally have days of warning, and so evacuation of the facility is likely in most cases. However, occupied schools that are schools could be occupied if they're designated as hurricane evacuation areas. Tornadoes, you have minutes of warning. Generally consider them to be occupied given that lack of warning time. Tsunami, you have minutes of warning to hours of warning for distant tsunamis. So evacuation in advance is likely in most cases, but again, if the school has a designated vertical evacuation structure, you'll see it as occupied. And then high winds, they vary to minutes to hours, and typically school buildings would be occupied. So let's talk about the safety provided by building codes. In engineering, life safety is used to describe a level of design. It's considered a risk category. The main goal behind life safety is to prevent fatalities and serious injuries due to failure or collapse of the structural elements. Many assume that governments require school buildings to be safe and minimally damaged during a natural hazard event. Unfortunately, that's not really true. Most local governments require new schools to be designed and constructed to meet locally adopted building codes, which generally are based on state or model codes. For most local codes, new schools are designed to meet the high occupancy requirements, but these are not as robust as code requirements for emergency shelters. In some schools, school construction might be governed by statewide school construction codes and may differ from other building codes. We touched upon this earlier in a module where we talked about the special building code regulations for schools in California. Whenever building code in your school falls under, whatever building code it falls under, the objective of the adopted building code is to provide life safety at a minimum for some hazard events, but not necessarily prevention of structural damage to the school building. So how old are school buildings in the United States? Well, a study by the US Department of Education suggested that over 40% of the school buildings in the United States are over 15 years old. And that's significant because they were built to earlier building codes that may not provide the same resilience or strength that modern building codes do. The average public school building is over 40 years old. So working with this idea of older school buildings, they were not designed to meet the building codes that are in place in modern times. So consequently, they may not address all of the issues of safety that we have for modern buildings. Building codes and standards and material test methods improve over time as experts learn from hazard events in building science research. This is a condition where we see an earthquake, we see the damage or wind damage from a hurricane or a tornado, and we make adjustments to the building code. So modern building codes are generally considered more robust, and we find, in fact, the most substantive changes have been made to building code standards and tests since the 1990s. So by extrapolation, buildings constructed before the 1990s aren't under the same umbrella, if you will, of buildings, school buildings that are designed after that period. And then again, just because a building is built to code does not necessarily mean it will be fully functional or usable after a hazard event. After a school building is constructed, structural changes over a time to maintain or enhance it are generally not required. In other words, you're not required to make adjustments to meet modern building codes when those new codes are adopted. So let's take a case study look at the Cascadia earthquake and tsunami risk that Washington was interested in. So first, a little background. The Cascadia fault runs from northern Vancouver Island in Canada to Northern California. The last great Cascadia earthquake took place in the 1700s. Many cities are at risk to earthquake and tsunami, include Vancouver, Victoria, British Columbia, Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. Washington was particularly interested in how they scored relative to other areas in a similar exposure. Washington has 386,000 students, one in every three enrolled live in an earthquake-prone area and attend schools built before seismic-resistant codes were adopted statewide. 31,000 students in Washington attend schools that are in tsunami inundation zone. So this study produced the chart on the right, which was reported by the Seattle Times, showing the various involvements by British Columbia, Oregon, and California, and Washington. The first thing that they analyzed was, does the state or territory have policy on school seismic upgrades? And then the second was, have they done structural surveys of all the at-risk schools? And then the third was, have they dedicated funding for school retrofits? You can see by this chart that British Columbia, Oregon, and California, who are all on this same exposure, have indeed done things. They've established policies, they've done surveys of their at-risk schools, and they've dedicated funding to it. And they found that Washington had nothing in those categories. So they found that that was a motivating factor for them to be able to push forth legislation to do things. So what is this level of safety provided by building codes again? Many community leaders now argue that aiming for life safety only in school buildings, that is using the minimum requirements of a building code, is not really an adequate goal. A better objective, especially for new schools, is immediate occupancy. So immediate occupancy is really when you start designing, constructing, and maintaining schools to a higher standard so that they do not suffer significant damage and are more likely to be usable shortly after an event. Lifelines, water power, on-site emergency power, non-structural elements, and fixtures are designed and constructed beyond the building code minimums so that they remain functional. And then the immediate occupancy category aims to minimize the school disruption and improve community resilience, because school resumption can be closely tied to community recovery. So let's start by talking about existing schools and what we need to think about there. School districts and leaders in addressing their school's potential natural hazard risk should follow these steps. First, engage a qualified engineering or architectural firm to determine the school building vulnerabilities. Secondly, identify and evaluate a range of mitigation options and corresponding costs. So one, you've identified the building vulnerabilities, and now you've characterized how much it'll cost to mitigate some of those dangers. Third is to develop a plan to fund and implement mitigation actions. So that may require a long-term program to fund and implement things like incremental building improvements. The replacement of the existing facility with a new facility is also a possible mitigation option. And then, while some argue that knowing a building's vulnerability makes the owner legally liable to address them, deliberately ignoring a known risk can also make the owner and other responsible parties legally liable. So let's talk about the process for identifying building vulnerabilities, which requires advice from architects and engineers. A great resource is the case studies document that was created by the Earthquake Engineering's Research Institute's School Earthquake Safety Initiative, which collects many of the successful U.S. school seismic screening programs. You can find a copy of that by following the link that's on the screen. So the first step in determining that is to have the experts identify the preliminary characteristics like building age, type of construction, and hazard exposure. If a school is pre-designated as emergency shelter during natural hazard or to be used after an event to help with recovery, identifying the possible red flags in this first step is particularly important. And again, this is if it's pre-designated as a shelter. One, is there enough space to accommodate community members? Is the space to be used as an emergency shelter or recovery center? Will the facility have continuous power and utilities? If food preparation and delivery is anticipated, are supplies stored on site, and are the staffing needs addressed? Now talking about identifying and evaluating these mitigation options, they can range in scope significantly, both in terms of the scope, how much you're going to do, the cost, how much you're willing to put forth to mitigate, the implementation time. Sometimes it can take years. Sometimes it only takes time during unoccupied slots of time for schools, the level of disruption that's involved, the required personnel, and then the effectiveness of this selected risk reduction strategy. All those things can vary and figure into evaluating these mitigation options. Options should be evaluated in light of the building code requirements, obviously for repairs and improvements. Most improvements to strengthen buildings will be viewed favorably from the building departments as long as the overall building is not adversely affected. So these would be voluntary upgrades to buildings. So identifying and evaluating these mitigation options, also, there are many examples where it could be taken alongside a major maintenance action. For instance, re-roofing a building is an excellent time to do some seismic rehabilitation or roofing rehabilitation to make it more resilient to natural hazards. Relevant requirements should be discussed and evaluated with the design professional before committing to these changes. In developing an implementation plan, after you've seen all of the vulnerabilities or put them on the table and the mitigation options have been identified and the challenges of prioritizing and phasing these actions, building up some community and political support, then you need to think about raising funds. Seeking funds is probably the biggest obstacle that school leaders will ultimately face. School leaders will likely need to prioritize mitigation activities and focus on the worst first concept, addressing the most pressing vulnerabilities facing the largest number of children first. And we'll need to have community discussions and raise awareness of the risk and support for mitigation action. It's also a critical element to getting to these actions funded. We'll speak more to that in the whole community module, which is later in this series. So what are some of the key steps in working with existing buildings? Well, one is determining the vulnerability by engaging that team of qualified engineers and architects to conduct that school building assessment. Secondly is identifying and mitigating all the options to address the significant vulnerabilities, and then develop this plan to implement the building mitigation actions over time, depending on the needed scope and cost and participation of community stakeholders. So now let's switch to new buildings and look at some of those key steps. Well, for new buildings, you have the advantage of being able to site them in areas where hazards may not be as problematic. So smart site selection is one of the key elements to understand about new building construction. You'll also be designing to relevant building codes, and you want to consider whether you make your buildings more resilient. So going above that life safety standard that I was talking about to making the building immediately occupiable or functional. You also want to go through the exercise of understanding how the school might be conceived as an emergency shelter for the community and integrate that into the design of the building. This is the easiest place to accomplish that kind of resilience for schools, is to do it in the initial design of a new building structure. So we know, for instance, that for new building construction, adding more hazard resistance typically only increases the construction by a small amount. For example, studies have shown that there's probably an increase of less than 2% of the overall cost when we step up and do a more resilient building design for new structures, new school structures. So smart site selection, so you want to site buildings out of flood zones or away from tsunamis and flood risks. Communities with seismic risk want to make considerations of the soils that the buildings are sited on, the landslide potential, liquefaction zones, and then also for tsunamis, you want to think about evacuation routes. So in new building design, they must be according to the state building codes. Usually these codes are nationally recognized and they are consensus standards. In some states, school construction might be governed by a state construction code. School buildings today usually require or be required to be constructed stronger than residential or commercial spaces. So relevant building codes and resilient designs. Most building codes treat schools as high occupancy facilities, and these codes require a slightly higher level or greater level of protection. If community intends to use that building as an emergency shelter, as I've mentioned, it must be reflected in the design criteria because emergency shelters need to be designed to that higher standard. Investing more in building design obviously is important. As I've mentioned, it pays off in the long run. It can save lives and help reduce repair costs. That increase of 1 to 2% can be used for a longer period of reoccupancy, and you can get your communities back up and running in a quicker fashion. So if the local officials and the community leaders expect school buildings to serve as emergency shelters, this should be addressed in the conceptual design of the phase of the new building. Emergency shelter and recovery centers requirements vary significantly by the hazard being addressed. Consider that natural hazards that face your school community specifically. So let's talk about another case study of a tsunami risk and response. So this was a tsunami evacuation refuge center that was proposed under Project Safe Haven in the state of Washington for Grays Harbor County and Acosta School District. They wanted to get local funding to build a tsunami evacuation center and refuge as part of a new replacement to an elementary school. The roof of a gymnasium serves as that refuge center, which is sized for both the students in that school and the local population. The total project cost was about $13,800,000. This is a picture of that particular school. You can see in the lower right-hand corner the existing classrooms and the bridge to the classrooms in the middle. And then that new structure was constructed as a gymnasium. And then the 4 towers on the corners of the building are places that you can move from the ground up to that rooftop, which would be the safe zone in evacuation for tsunami evacuation. This particular structure was designed to FEMA P-646A, vertical evacuation from tsunamis. It's a companion guide for state and local communities on how to design these. So there's no confusion. This document was jointly funded by FEMA and NOAA. So let's talk a little bit more about new school buildings and the key summaries to consider. First is identifying the appropriate sites for the new school buildings, considering the hazard-specific concerns for that particular building in that site. Understand the relevant building codes and the corresponding level of safety that they provide, and decide if the new building, if the new school design should go beyond the code requirements. And then determine if the school building will also serve as a designated shelter and recovery center. And lastly, the importance of quality assurance measures. Buildings that have had their designs reviewed for compliance with code have resulted in superior earthquake performance. So this is another level of review for school buildings that has proven to be, through a report by the California Seismic Safety Commission in 2007, to be highly effective in catching any mistakes or things that are not seen in the original design. Schools should be designed and constructed with highly qualified professionals and with appropriate materials and proper inspection procedures. And then one way to help ensure the intended design goals are achieved is to have what is called a peer review. This is a second set of eyes on the design, which can oftentimes result in a safer building yet. So what are some of the quality assurance measures that are of importance to us? Rigorous oversight of the construction process and inspection of the building will greatly improve the hazard performance. So this is critically important in construction of schools and should be taken to heart. Ongoing attention to maintaining the structure and their resilience is needed to ensure that the schools remain safe. And then knowledge of natural hazards and engineering can change with time, and understanding that will help you have better schools. With that, I'd like to throw it back to Gigi and see if there are any questions that I can answer. Gigi?
Thanks, Barry. Yes, one question. So why is it important to understand the level of safety concept in building codes?
Oh, yeah. Well, as an engineer, I certainly appreciate that all buildings are minimally designed to save lives in what we call this life safety risk category in our building codes, but only if the consequences of losing that building because it may not be repairable or usable following a hazard event is understood by the community as an acceptable risk. I think a better goal is to try to make that liability an asset by thinking of schools as infrastructure in our communities, the lifeblood needed after an event to sustain our recovery and maintain educational continuity. This means thinking of a higher risk categories like immediate occupancy or operational makes more sense. We just saw, with just a small increase in investment, as I showed you, these school buildings can be contributing greater resilience to our entire community. So it's important to think about that up front when you make your decisions about level of safety for schools. And so that would be the direction I would lead you.
Great, thank you. So this concludes training module 2, identifying relevant natural hazards and making school buildings safer. In the next training video, module 3, Lori will discuss guidance on planning school emergency response and disaster recovery. We hope to see you there.